The sound of her cat's soft purring filled the room as Lisa scrolled through her phone, the glow of the screen casting eerie shadows on the walls. It was late, and she knew she should be sleeping, but she was hooked on a thread from her favorite subreddit, Spooky Reddit Stories. Users from all around the world shared their creepy experiences, and Lisa had always found comfort in the fact that these stories were just that, stories. Tonight, however, something felt different. The top post was from a user named Whisper in the Dark. The title read, "Whatever you do, don't read this alone." Lisa chuckled softly, thinking it was a clever marketing trick to grab attention. She snuggled deeper into her blankets and began to read. Have you ever felt like someone is watching you? I'm not talking about the paranoia you get from watching too many horror movies. I'm talking about the real gut-wrenching feeling that there is someone, or something, lurking just out of sight. My story starts with a Reddit post, just like this one. I live in a small town where nothing much happens. A few months ago, I stumbled upon this subreddit and quickly became addicted to the tales of terror. One night, much like tonight, I found a post warning me not to read it alone. I ignored the warning, of course. I'm a skeptic at heart. As I read the story, strange things began to happen. My lights flickered and my cat, usually calm, started hissing at the empty corner of my room. I brushed it off as a coincidence. But then my phone screen went black, and I saw the reflection of something behind me, something dark and formless. I spun around, but there was nothing there. My heart was pounding, and I felt a cold sweat trickle down my back. The post had warned that acknowledging the entity would make it stronger, but I had scoffed at the idea. Desperate for answers, I scrolled through the comments. Many users claimed to have experienced similar things. They called it the Watcher, an entity that thrived on fear and could enter our world through stories like these. Some said it was a shadow person. Others believed it was a demon. Whatever it was real. My lights flickered again, and this time, I heard a whisper. It was faint, like someone calling my name from far away. I was paralyzed with fear, my eyes darting around the room. Then the whisper grew louder, more insistent. It was right next to my ear. "Get out!" it hissed. I bolted from my room and ran to my neighbor's house. They found me on their porch, shaking and incoherent. I stayed with them for the night, too afraid to go back home. The next morning I returned to find my room trashed. My belongings were scattered, and deep scratches marred the walls. I moved out the next day, but the Watcher followed me. No matter where I went, it was there, always watching, always whispering. I've learned to live with it, but I'm warning you now. If you're reading this alone, stop. Don't look behind you. Don't acknowledge it. It thrives on your fear. You've been warned. Lisa's heart raced as she finished the post. Her room felt colder, and the silence was oppressive. She looked at her cat, hoping for some comfort, but the feline was staring intently at the corner of the room, ears flat and eyes wide. A chill ran down Lisa's spine. She remembered the warning from the post. Don't acknowledge it. Trying to calm herself, she locked her phone and set it on her nightstand. She took a deep breath and tried to think rationally. It was just a story, a well-crafted piece of fiction meant to scare. That's all. But then the lights flickered. Once, twice. Her heart pounded in her chest as she felt an inexplicable urge to look at the corner her cat was fixated on. Slowly, she turned her head. Nothing. Lisa let out a shaky laugh, feeling foolish. It was all in her head. She picked up her phone again, intending to scroll through some light-hearted memes to ease her nerves. However, her phone screen remained black. She pressed the power button repeatedly, but it wouldn't turn on. A whisper filled the room, soft at first, then growing louder. It was indistinct, but she could make out her name being called over and over. Her cat hissed and bolted under the bed. Lisa's breath caught in her throat as the whisper turned into a low growl. She could feel a presence behind her, a cold, malevolent force that sent shivers down her spine. Her body refused to move, paralyzed by terror. The growling stopped, replaced by a single, clear word spoken right next to her ear: leave. She looked at her cat, hoping for some comfort, but the feline was staring intently at the corner of the room, ears flat and eyes wide. A chill ran down Lisa's spine. She remembered the warning from the post: don't acknowledge it. Trying to calm herself, she locked her phone and set it on her nightstand. She took a deep breath and tried to think rationally. It was just a story, a well-crafted piece of fiction meant to scare. That's all. But then the lights flickered. Once, twice. Her heart pounded in her chest as she felt an inexplicable urge to look at the corner her cat was fixated on. Slowly, she turned her head. Nothing. Lisa let out a shaky laugh, feeling foolish. It was all in her head. She picked up her phone again, intending to scroll through some light-hearted memes to ease her nerves. However, her phone screen remained black. She pressed the power button repeatedly, but it wouldn't turn on. A whisper filled the room, soft at first, then growing louder. It was indistinct, but she could make out her name being called over and over. Her cat hissed and bolted under the bed. Lisa's breath caught in her throat as the whisper turned into a low growl. She could feel a presence behind her, a cold, malevolent force that sent shivers down her spine. Her body refused to move, paralyzed by terror. The growling stopped, replaced by a single, clear word spoken right next to her ear: leave. With a surge of adrenaline, Lisa leaped out of bed and ran for the door. She fumbled with the lock, her hands shaking uncontrollably. Finally, she yanked the door open and raced down the hall, not daring to look back. She spent the night at a friend's place, recounting her experience through tears and gasps. Her friend listened, skeptical but concerned. The next morning, Lisa returned to her apartment with her friend by her side. Everything seemed normal, no signs of disturbance, no scratches on the walls. But Lisa couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Her cat refused to enter the bedroom, and she noticed her belongings subtly out of place. She tried to resume her normal life, but the whispers and cold drafts persisted, always at the edge of her senses. Desperate, Lisa reached out to the original poster of the Redditor's Curse, hoping for advice. She received a reply: "The Watcher is real. It won't leave you alone now. Your only hope is to pass it on. Tell your story, make others read it, but remember they must read it alone." Lisa hesitated, torn between protecting others and freeing herself from the torment. Finally, she posted her experience on spooky Reddit stories, mirroring the warnings she had once ignored. She hoped someone would heed them, but she knew curiosity often overpowered caution. As she hit post, her room grew colder, and the whispers returned. The Watcher was still there, waiting, feeding on her fear. And somewhere, someone else was about to read her story, alone, unwittingly inviting the Watcher into their life. Sarah had always loved urban legends. She spent countless nights on Reddit, reading through threads about haunted places, cryptid sightings, and strange occurrences. Her favorite subreddit was Urban Legends, where users shared both well-known and obscure stories from around the world. One evening, she stumbled upon a post titled "The Midnight Train." The post was long and detailed, describing an urban legend from a small town in Eastern Europe. According to the legend, there was a train that only appeared at midnight. It would stop at the town's abandoned railway station, and anyone who boarded it would disappear without a trace. The post included a chilling account from a user who claimed to have seen the train. "I was visiting relatives in the town," the user wrote. "I heard the sound of a train whistle at midnight, which was strange because the station had been closed for decades. I went to investigate and saw a train, old and rusted with no lights. It stopped at the station, and I could see shadowy figures inside. I ran back home and never spoke of it again, but I can't forget those empty, hollow eyes staring at me from the windows. Sarah was intrigued. She loved a good ghost story, and this one was unlike anything she had heard before. She spent the next few days researching the town and the legend, finding several similar accounts scattered across obscure websites and forums. The more she read, the more fascinated she became. A week later, Sarah decided to visit the town. She had some vacation time saved up, and the thought of experiencing something so eerie was too tempting to resist. She booked a flight, rented a car, and soon found herself driving through the quiet, misty countryside. The town was small and unassuming, with cobblestone streets and old stone buildings. It had an air of quiet desolation, as if it were frozen in time. The locals were friendly but reserved, and when she mentioned the midnight train, they quickly changed the subject or walked away. Undeterred, Sarah made her way to the abandoned railway station just before midnight. The station was overgrown with weeds, and the tracks were rusty and broken. She found a spot to sit and waited, her heart pounding with anticipation and fear. As the clock struck midnight, she heard it, the distant sound of a train whistle. She strained her eyes in the darkness and saw a faint light in the distance, slowly growing brighter. The train was coming. The train rolled into the station with a screech of metal on metal. It was old and decrepit, just as the legend had described. The windows were dark, but Sarah could see vague shapes moving inside. Her breath caught in her throat as the train came to a halt. The doors slid open with a rusty groan, and a cold, unnatural wind blew through the station. Sarah hesitated, her curiosity battling with her fear. She took a step forward, then another, until she was standing at the edge of the platform, looking into the train's dark interior. "Don't do it," a voice whispered behind her. She turned to see an old woman standing a few feet away, her face lined with worry. "Once you board, there's no coming back." Sarah nodded, acknowledging the warning, but her curiosity was overpowering. She took a deep breath and stepped onto the train. The doors closed behind her with a final, resounding clang. Inside, the train was dimly lit by flickering overhead lights. The air was thick with dust and the scent of decay. Sarah walked down the aisle, peering into the compartments. Most were empty, but a few contained shadowy figures, their faces obscured. She felt their eyes on her, cold and unblinking. The train began to move, slowly at first, then picking up speed. Sarah felt a rising sense of panic. She tried to open the doors, but they were locked. The windows wouldn't budge either. She was trapped. The lights flickered more violently, and the temperature dropped. Sarah's breath came out in visible puffs as she made her way to the front of the train, hoping to find the conductor or some way to stop the train. Instead, she found an empty control room, the controls covered in a thick layer of dust. Desperation set in. She turned to leave and froze. Standing at the far end of the corridor was a figure, tall and dark, its eyes glowing a sickly yellow. It started to move toward her, its footsteps echoing ominously through the train. Sarah backed away, her mind racing. She remembered the old woman's warning, the countless stories she had read. She knew she had to get off the train, but how? The figure drew closer, its eyes boring into her. In a last-ditch effort, Sarah ran to the nearest window and threw herself against it. The glass shattered, and she felt a rush of cold air as she tumbled out of the train, landing hard on the gravel beside the tracks. She lay there, dazed and bruised, as the train continued its journey into the darkness. Slowly, she got to her feet and looked around. She was back at the abandoned station, the town's lights faint in the distance. Sarah limped back to her car and drove to her hotel. her mind reeling from the experience. She left the town the next morning, vowing never to return. When she got home, she deleted her Reddit account and all her notes about the midnight train. She tried to move on with her life, but the memory of those hollow, yellow eyes haunted her dreams. Years later, she still shudders whenever she hears a train whistle in the night. She knows that somewhere out there, the midnight train is still running, waiting for its next passenger, and she can only hope that no one else will make the same mistake she did. Nestled at the edge of a small town, the house on Cypress Hill stood abandoned for decades. It was a towering Victorian mansion, its windows shattered and its paint peeling away in long, thin strips. Stories about the house were passed down through generations, each more terrifying than the last. Some claimed it was haunted by the spirits of a murdered family, others whispered of dark rituals and ancient curses. But most dismissed the tales as mere folklore, nothing more than ghost stories to scare the children. That changed when Sarah decided to move in. Sarah had always been fascinated by the paranormal. As a renowned horror novelist, she thrived on the macabre and the terrifying. When she heard about the house on Cypress Hill, she saw an opportunity to find inspiration for her next novel. Despite the warnings from the locals, she bought the house for a ridiculously low price and moved in, eager to uncover its secrets. The first few days were uneventful. Sarah spent her time cleaning, unpacking, and exploring the vast, decrepit mansion. She marveled at the intricate woodwork and the faded elegance that hinted at its former grandeur. But as the days turned into nights, she began to notice strange occurrences. At first, it was little things: a cold draft in a room with no windows open, the faint sound of footsteps echoing through the halls when she was alone. Sarah dismissed these as quirks of an old house, nothing more. But then, the whispers started. Late at night, as she sat in her study writing, she would hear them, soft, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to come from the walls themselves. She tried to ignore them, focusing on her work, but the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They seemed to call her name, beckoning her to follow. One night, unable to resist the pull of the voices, Sarah grabbed a flashlight and followed the sound. It led her to the basement, a place she had avoided since moving in. The door creaked open, revealing a steep staircase descending into darkness. She hesitated for a moment before taking a deep breath and stepping down. The basement was damp and cold, the air thick with the scent of mildew. Her flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing stacks of old furniture and boxes covered in dust. As she ventured deeper, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. She could almost make out words now, phrases that sent chills down her spine. "Help us! Free us!" The flashlight flickered, and Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. She reached the far end of the basement, where a large, ornate mirror stood against the wall. It was out of place, its polished surface starkly contrasting with the decay around it. The whispers seemed to emanate from the mirror itself. Transfixed, Sarah approached the mirror. Her reflection stared back at her, but there was something wrong with it. Its eyes seemed to move independently, following her every movement. She reached out a trembling hand and touched the glass. The whispers stopped abruptly, and for a moment there was silence. Then, the reflection smiled. Sarah stumbled back, her flashlight clattering to the ground. The reflection moved on its own, stepping out of the mirror and into the room. It was her, but twisted and wrong. Its eyes were hollow, and its smile was a grotesque mockery of her own. "You shouldn't have come here," it said, its voice a distorted echo of her own. "This place is cursed. Now you belong to it." Paralyzed with fear, Sarah watched as the reflection advanced on her. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. The last thing she saw was its cold, empty eyes before everything went black. The next morning, the local sheriff received a call from a concerned neighbor. They hadn't seen Sarah in days, and her car was still parked in the driveway. The sheriff agreed to check on her, though he expected to find nothing more than a reclusive writer lost in her work. He arrived at the house on Cypress Hill and knocked on the door. When there was no answer, he tried the handle and found it unlocked. The house was eerily quiet as he stepped inside, calling out for Sarah. There was no response. He searched the house, finally descending into the basement. His flashlight revealed the same old furniture and boxes, but something else caught his eye: the large, ornate mirror. He approached it, unease growing in his chest. In the reflection, he saw Sarah. She stood behind him, her eyes hollow and her smile twisted. He spun around, but there was no one there. The reflection remained, staring at him with a look of pure malice. The sheriff stumbled back and the mirror began to shimmer. The whispers filled the room, louder and more insistent than ever. He turned and fled, the sound of his own heartbeat drowning out the voices. He never spoke of what he saw in the house on Cypress Hill. Sarah was never found, and the house was abandoned once more. The townspeople whispered that the curse had claimed another victim, but no one dared to go near the mansion. Years passed, and the stories about the house grew more sinister. They said that if you looked into the mirror, you would see the souls of those trapped within, begging for release. And if you stayed too long, you would join them, becoming another whisper in the dark. The house still stands, a silent sentinel on Cypress Hill, waiting for the next curious soul to cross its threshold. And the whispers continue, echoing through the halls, a chilling reminder of the horrors that lie within.